Frank Miller, 81, sat upright in the first row of economy, just behind the thin partition that separated business class from the rest of the plane. He held a folded American flag in one hand and an old, faded backpack in the other. The patch on it was barely legible now, a medic's insignia, worn from decades of weather and time. Inside, wrapped in an old undershirt, were two items, a Purple Heart and a handwritten letter he had carried for 50 years. He had lived quietly since retiring from the U.S. Army. After serving as a combat medic through 2 wars, Frank had moved to a modest apartment in Phoenix. He kept few possessions, lived on his pension, and visited the VA clinic every third Thursday. But this trip wasn't routine. He was flying to New York to fulfill a promise he'd made to a fallen friend, a promise made in a dusty field hospital under mortar fire, when death hovered like a shadow. His hand had gripped the trembling fingers of a young lieutenant who wasn't going to make it, and in that blur of chaos and blood, a dying man had asked Frank to bring a letter home. Frank had never been able to do it. The family had moved. The Army's records were incomplete. The letter remained with him, tucked away and reread every Memorial Day. Then, one day, a name had surfaced in a veteran's newsletter, a grandson, living in Queens, who had written about his search for the man who had held his grandfather's hand in his final moments. The moment Frank read it, he knew it was time. He had originally been assigned a more comfortable seat, closer to the exit. It had cost him a bit more, but comfort wasn't why he'd chosen it. His knees didn't bend well anymore, and getting to the restroom was easier from there. But while waiting to board, he'd seen an older woman standing awkwardly at the counter, her hand trembling as she clutched her boarding pass. Her cane slipped, and as she stooped to retrieve it, her bag spilled open. Frank didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, helped her gather her things, and offered her his seat without a second thought. The airline staff thanked him politely, but it was clear the gesture was seen as quaint, nothing more than a harmless inconvenience for the crew to fix. They moved him to another available seat, the first row of economy, right beside the business class curtain. Frank didn't mind. His generation rarely did. He had once slept in ditches, under trucks, and half-collapsed tents. A slightly stiffer seat was a small price for helping someone. He settled in quietly, his cap resting atop his pack. The young couple to his left were already immersed in their earbuds and neck pillows, disconnected from the world. The man behind him tapped his tray impatiently before takeoff, clearly annoyed at the minor delay in boarding. Frank simply stared ahead, eyes drawn to the porthole window where the wing curved into view, his reflection barely visible in the glass. When the flight attendant began distributing meals, Frank gently pressed the call button. She arrived moments later, efficient and smiling, the way airline employees are trained to be. He asked if it was possible to receive something simpler, maybe just a roll or a piece of fruit. His stomach had grown sensitive over the years, and the heavier food left him nauseated. She glanced at his boarding pass, her demeanor shifting as her smile evaporated. "You're not in business class," she said, her tone sharpening, just loud enough for several rows to hear. "We can't make special requests here. Please wait your turn." It wasn't her words but the volume and indifference that made people look. Across the aisle, a woman lowered her magazine slightly, curious. A teenage boy 2 rows back stopped scrolling on his phone. Frank simply nodded and turned off the call light. A man nearby scoffed, a corporate type with polished shoes and a tablet already displaying charts and numbers. He looked at Frank's cap, the worn, threadbare Army insignia on the front, and rolled his eyes with a smirk. The message was clear, another old man clinging to a past no one cared about. Frank removed the cap from his head and placed it gently in his lap. He didn't respond. Didn't explain himself. He sat as he always had, upright, composed, a quiet presence in a noisy world. The flight continued in silence for a few more minutes. The woman beside him reached for a blanket and turned away slightly. Frank stared at the curtain in front of him, thin fabric dividing the cabin, but in that moment it felt like something larger. A metaphor. The separation between those remembered and those forgotten. Between service and convenience. Between the noise of the present and the silence of sacrifice. The flight attendant returned down the aisle, now carrying trays for the business class passengers. She didn't look at Frank as she passed, though her elbow brushed the corner of his folded flag. She didn't notice. Frank adjusted the flag, ensuring it remained tightly folded, the blue and white stars still crisp. He had learned long ago that dignity doesn't depend on the behavior of others. It depends on your own. He looked out the window again. Clouds drifted beneath them, thick and cotton-like, stretching to the horizon. Somewhere below, beneath those clouds, was New York, and the grave of a man who died with hope in his eyes, asking only that his mother receive the letter in his pocket. Frank had no anger. Just a kind of ache that was quieter than sorrow. It was the ache of being visible but unseen. Recognized but forgotten. Honored in speeches but dismissed in silence. Still, he said nothing. The folded flag stayed in his hand. The promise remained alive. Somewhere near the back of the plane, a young airman in uniform sat with his eyes fixed forward. He had seen the exchange. His uniform was crisp, his posture straight, but his jaw clenched slightly as he watched the old man adjust the flag on his lap. The moment hadn't been loud, but it had been clear. The flight attendant's sharp tone, the visible discomfort of the passengers nearby, the unmistakable mockery from the man with the tablet, it all formed a picture. And for someone trained to read a room, trained to assess before acting, it was impossible not to understand what had just happened. The young airman, Staff Sergeant Eli Townsend, didn't say anything at first. He waited until the crew rotated. There was a shift change just after the cart had been rolled back to the galley. He rose from his seat, quiet and deliberate, and walked toward the back, where a senior flight attendant was organizing supplies. Their conversation was brief, hushed tones, a soft mention of a name, a quiet nod. When Eli said the name, the flight attendant froze. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her expression reset. She asked him to wait and stepped through the curtain. A few minutes later, the original flight attendant returned to the galley, her face pale. She didn't speak to Frank again. Across the cabin, the atmosphere began to change. Nothing dramatic, no sudden announcements, no obvious reversals, but something subtle. The din of conversations quieted. The crew began glancing toward Frank's row more often, though less out of scrutiny and more like recognition. A few passengers whispered. Someone tapped a phone screen and began typing. The man with the tablet, still smug, heard the name too. It traveled in low voices, passed between curious passengers and murmured over shared earbuds. He searched it on his device. The articles came up quickly, archived pieces from military news sites, a commendation ceremony decades ago, a photograph of a younger Frank Miller receiving a medal with bloodied sleeves and a half-burned medical bag at his side. One headline stood out, Combat Medic Pulls 5 from Fire, Purple Heart Recipient Stays on Duty After Injuries. The man blinked. He read further. Korea. A fire at a field hospital. A supply tent struck. Frank had run in twice. Once to carry out an unconscious lieutenant. Again to retrieve a young radio operator buried beneath rubble. He'd refused medical treatment until every soldier was accounted for. The same man who had just been denied a meal modification. The same man who had quietly removed his cap instead of arguing. The man with the cap now sat silently, hands resting on the flag like a final salute. Eli Townsend returned to his seat. His movements weren't showy, but the respect was unmistakable. From his breast pocket, he pulled a small envelope and a polished coin. Military challenge coins weren't officially regulated, but their meaning ran deep among those who served. He glanced toward Frank, who met his gaze with a faint nod. No words passed. None were needed. A moment later, one of the senior flight attendants approached Frank. Her expression had softened, not the professional smile she wore during beverage service, but something deeper. She knelt slightly to speak to him at eye level, and after a few quiet words, Frank hesitated. She gestured toward the front. Business class. Frank shook his head. She waited. Eli stood. Their eyes met again. Frank didn't want special treatment. He never had. He hadn't worn his medals on this flight, hadn't asked for boarding privileges, hadn't even requested help storing his bag. He had come to fulfill a promise, not to be noticed. But Eli understood that this wasn't about comfort. It was about acknowledgement. Frank slowly stood, joints stiff and movements deliberate. His knees locked for a moment as he straightened. He lifted his pack, tucked the flag gently under his arm, and allowed the flight attendant to escort him forward. The curtain parted. For the first time since he'd boarded, the mood of the cabin shifted tangibly. Not in ceremony, not yet, but in perception. Some passengers sat up straighter. Others put their phones away. The man with the tablet lowered it completely. As Frank stepped into business class, the older gentleman in the aisle seat stood up unprompted, offering his place without hesitation. The crew didn't stop him. Another attendant brought a thin blanket and helped Frank settle his belongings. The flag stayed on his lap. For the rest of the flight, the business class section remained unusually quiet. Somewhere over Ohio, the captain made a routine announcement about weather and time of arrival. But the eyes of several passengers lingered on Frank, as if realizing that they were witnessing something not just rare, but deeply personal. The truth was beginning to surface, not as a grand reveal, but as a slow ripple. The airmen knew more. The crew had started to ask questions. And the name? The name that Eli had whispered, the one that had made the flight attendant turn pale, wasn't just any fallen officer. It was a name carried forward through family, service, and memory. Frank Miller hadn't just saved lives in the fire. He had saved someone that mattered to someone on board. The flight carried on through the sky, but below the surface, threads of history were beginning to connect. A promise made long ago had brought Frank into this cabin. A moment of quiet dignity had drawn eyes to him. And now, a new presence, recognition, had taken its seat beside him. The plane landed just after dawn. A pale, orange-pink light spilled over the tarmac as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. The morning felt still, hushed in the way airports rarely are, as if something sacred had accompanied the descent. Frank Miller remained seated until the cabin emptied. He made no move to stand early, no glance at the overhead bin, no sign of urgency. When the seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers stood and shuffled into the aisle, but no one asked him to move. Not the flight attendants. Not the other travelers. It was as if everyone understood this wasn't just another flight, and Frank wasn't just another passenger. At the front of the aircraft, the entire crew stood in a silent line beside the door. The young attendant who had dismissed him earlier was there, eyes downcast, her hands clasped in front of her. No apology was spoken, but the silence between them held something that words couldn't reach. Frank offered her a gentle nod. Not of forgiveness, exactly, but of grace. As Frank stepped into the jet bridge, Staff Sergeant Eli Townsend was waiting for him. Not as an escort, but as a companion. He didn't salute. He didn't speak. He simply fell into step beside the older man, and together they walked the long corridor into the terminal. At baggage claim, Frank refused assistance. He carried only his backpack. The folded flag never left his hands. Near the exit, uniformed personnel began to take notice. A Marine corporal paused mid-step. Then a Navy petty officer stopped and turned. Word spread quickly, military eyes are trained to notice small things, and Frank's presence, quiet though it was, struck something deep. One by one, they came to a halt, forming an informal line as Frank passed. Each man and woman saluted. Frank nodded once to each, his limp slightly more pronounced now, his steps slower but steady. Outside, the city bustled as always, horns, shouts, the movement of people with places to be. But in this small corner of the world, time stretched. A few travelers began filming. Others simply watched. A car pulled up, a modest sedan with government plates. A woman stepped out, early 40s, composed but visibly emotional. Her eyes scanned the crowd and found Eli first. Then they rested on Frank. She approached with hesitant steps. Her gaze dropped to the flag in Frank's arms, then rose to meet his. "My father," she began, voice trembling. Frank reached into his coat and pulled out a thin envelope, its edges softened by time. He placed it into her hands with reverence. "I kept it," he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked down at the familiar handwriting. "I was told it was lost." "It was never lost," Frank replied. "Just waiting." Beside her, Eli stood motionless, watching the final connection unfold. The flag, the medal, and the letter, all now returning to the family of a man who had never truly left their lives. The next morning, under the quiet branches of Arlington's trees, Frank stood beside a headstone in Section 60. The grave was modest, the name carved cleanly into the white marble. Lieutenant Thomas J. Harlan. Age 24. K** led in action, 1972. The air was cold, but the light was soft, one of those still mornings where the only sounds are the wind and your own breath. Frank stood with the family, Eli by his side. The folded flag was handed from one hand to another, with no ceremony but full honor. A few others had gathered. Veterans. Word had spread through quiet channels, an email here, a phone call there. They came not for obligation, but out of something deeper. A sense of duty that outlives enlistment. A recognition of what matters. Frank didn't speak at the grave. He had already said everything that needed saying. After the moment had passed, and most had dispersed, one veteran noticed Frank's limp and offered his arm. Frank smiled gently and shook his head. "These steps are mine," he said. But something had changed. The other veterans walked with him, not ahead, not behind, but beside him. Step by step, they left the cemetery together, not as strangers, but as men and women bound by the quiet language of sacrifice. Later that afternoon, back at the hotel, Frank opened his pack one last time. The pocket that had held the letter was now empty. Only the Purple Heart remained, its ribbon worn and frayed. He didn't place it on the nightstand or tuck it away. He just held it for a while, watching how the light caught its surface. It wasn't about recognition. It had never been about medals or headlines. It was about the weight of a promise carried through time, delivered without expectation. Outside the window, life continued. Cars moved. People rushed. But inside that room, time sat still, wrapped in memory. In the end, Frank would fly home to Phoenix. No reporters would call. No ceremonies would follow. Just a quiet return to a life of solitude and reflection. But something had shifted. Not in Frank, but around him. Those who had witnessed the flight would remember. The crew would speak of it long after. The name, once faded into the background of war, would be spoken again. And the story, Frank's story, would travel farther than he ever intended. Because kindness doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes, it only needs a promise. And those who keep promises change the world. Kindness without question is enough.